Well, thanks for letting me come here today to do an interview with you to talk about your photography. Can I just start by asking about how you first got started in photography?
It was an accident really, because back in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, back in Belfast, there wasn't a huge amount of opportunity for anybody really, apart from it was either the shipyards of Belfast or the dole queues, to be quite honest. And a lot of the kids, my generation, they started to follow music and the punk music, and punk exploded in Belfast. Bands like Stiff Little Fingers and the Undertones, and I followed them. You know, I was sort of a young punk that didn't dress as a punk, because my mother used to make sure that I didn't go out of the house looking disgraceful.
Or didn't attract too much attention.
Exactly that, and we were all sort of brought together, and I desperately wanted to be part of that whole scene. And I realised when I was 15, playing with my friends in a band, that I was never going to be in a good band or be a musician. So I used to follow the NME a lot and read the NME every week, and there was a photographer in there, a guy called Anton Corbin, Dutch photographer, who's really, quite honestly, shaped my vision of photography from an early age. Even currently, I still regard his work as quite something special. And I thought, well, if I can take pictures of the bands, then I can still be part of this photographic scene. So I started using those little thin Hamanix C110 cameras, you know, that had tiny little negatives. And I remember going and standing right at the front of the gigs and taking the pictures of the bands, and it was to get the pictures back was fantastic for me. And then around about the same time, it sounds terrible, my school was bombed or firebombed or something like that, and they built a whole brand new school, and one of the things in there was a darkroom, and the art teacher at the time had seen me with these little pictures, and he said, you know, well, buy some darkroom equipment. So I basically bought a darkroom. My father bought me a Pentax ME Super for my 17th birthday, and that was really the kickoff, and I started to submit pictures to the Irish equivalent of the NME, was called Hot Press, and that was really how I got into photography, and I became kind of known as the kid who had the camera when we were at gigs, and you know the sort of quite a sort of a nice collection of people who were punks in the day and stuff like that. You know, terrible pictures, but they're just nice to have. And also the bands from that time, you know, they're just a great personal legacy for me that I like to go and look at every now and then. And that's really how it started.
And then you came to London and you started assisting people, most notably Christopher Joyce.
Exactly. Well, I did my 3 years at Bournemouth and graduated, and part of the last year effectively was an internship crossover period where I'd actually met Chris in Belfast back when he did a little bit of a lecture, and I met him up at Focus on Photography when it was up in Birmingham or Harrogate. I was at Harrogate a million years ago. And I said, I've got to ask, so I went up and said, look, you know, I've met you in Belfast before, I'm trying to be an assistant, and it was the right place, the right time. His assistant had just told him she was leaving. He came up, I interviewed with him, and I started really as soon as I'd left college. I went straight from college to working for Chris.
He was a lovely gentleman, because I remember meeting him a couple of times. Once, I think the first time was in Amsterdam. I was doing some work for an agency there, and I bumped into him in a bar, and he'd been working actually for the same agency as I was, and yeah. I was there with my Mamiya camera and lots of flashlights and everything, and he just had his little Minolta camera or something like that. It was kind of funny. He just had one, and I think it had a kit lens on the front or something.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I took from Chris, because I mean, he was a very funny character, and actually he was so lighthearted about everything. I think that's what endeared him to people, but primarily more than anything, his passion was huge. And it's, you know, the legacy I take from working for Chris was his legacy of don't care what anybody else thinks, care about what you're taking and believe in what you're taking and want to take what you're taking rather than somebody else telling you you should be taking. Obviously in a commercial environment it's slightly different.
Okay. Now that you've been established in London for quite a few years now, from having moved from Belfast, what sort of specialisations are you doing photographically now these days?
Well, these days it's pretty much entirely automotive. I do a few little side projects for Fender guitars because it takes me back to that Belfast legacy of my music days, but it's pretty much totally automotive now and almost entirely CGI based. So generally now it's pretty much I get CAD data delivered to me and I have to then from that create the CGI images.
So you get car data, which you mean is like a 3D model that you can
Exactly,
then put into an environment.
Exactly that. If you can kind of imagine, I'm sure you watch these making of movies, you know, like Shrek or whatever, and Shrek's just a load of green lines running around the field. Well, it's exactly the same with the car. We get it arrives as a wireframe, which is the CAD data. Generally, it generates the same data that is used to make the car, and cars have millions and millions and millions of parts to them. So before it reaches us, it's purposed for, if you like, commercial use, where they take away all the nuts, bolts, washers that are hidden in the door panels and stuff, and then they strip it down to just the assets that you can see by the eye, both internally and primarily externally. And then from that, then we have to texture it and shade it and just make it look as close to the real thing as we possibly can.
And you're now at the stage where you're combining all that with the CGI aspect. So how does it fit together, you know, the sort of the process of making one of the compositions that you produce, say, for an advertising agency?
Well, a typical route for me, the workflow for a job is I get the brief as normal. Most of the stuff I do is primarily location based, although there are some general complete CGI studio builds that we have to do. But from a location point of view, we would go on location as normal, and I'd find the scene that I would find normally where I would put a car into, and I have to then imagine the space around that. So I'm kind of like using my experience to say, I know that a car would fit in that scene, and the light's going to come from this direction, and it's going to be this time of day, and we would set up as normal, and we use targets they're basically three-dimensional objects set within a normal scene. So for example, we would place that in the middle of the road where the car or the sofa or whatever it is we'd be photographing would sit. And then I'd do exactly the same as I would if there had been a real car, that I wait for the right light, the right time. I'll wait until the light falls behind a building or sun comes up around a corner. And then we shoot the backplates, so that we have this target in the middle of the scene, and we shoot that as we would normally. And the reason for the target is that when we come back to do the post-production, we have to imagine that scene in 3D space. And so the target allows us to take the 3D version of that target and exactly line it up on top of the 2D traditional backplate. And then when we're happy with that, we use the same lensing information, the same the distance from the camera that's already noted, and that gives us a really good start point. And when we have it exactly lined up, we can then transfer that target with the CAD data from the car or the object it has to be.
And like you're shooting, I think, is it worth a light map or whatever, where you're shooting HDR as well?
That's the next stage of the process, and with that, they're called a number of things. They're basically 360-degree HDRI, high dynamic range images, and they're basically 360-degree high dynamic range image, and we have to shoot that in the same space where the target was or the car would be, and the reason for that is that in order to make things real in CG land, they have to have the photorealism, and you do not and cannot get the photorealism unless you put the reflections of the scene back into the car. So it's not like even saying let's make the car a mirror and let's reflect it in the background. It's much more detailed and much more deep than that, because it takes the ambient light settings. It allows ray bounces between the object and the background, the floor of the scene where the shadows are made. So without that, you cannot. The 3D programs will make everything look like a cartoon if that's the case. So,
would you say that the CGI work now has completely replaced traditional car photography, where photography was carried out in a studio or on location?
I would say it's certainly in the advertising world and sort of high-end car brochure work, I'd say it's 90% of the way there, and it's a shame in many ways that it has that, because from a personal point of view, I find it I like having that whole theatre of light with the real thing there, but it's equally as challenging to have to produce the CG sort of thing as well. But I think it's driven by budgets all the time, and also timelines. So the clients don't have the budgets to spend on the projects they used to, and because they want things quicker, it's really the only alternative and the only way to do it. So I would say it's nearly there. I don't think it will ever totally replace it, but it's certainly a good 90%.
Because I think on your website it was interesting to see that you were actually doing a shot for real, if I can use that phrase, because you were shooting, all the traditional techniques, photographing a car. It looked more fun actually.
Well, it did, and then actually it brings you back to basics as a photographer, because you have to use your skill set and your intuition to know that, and you can see the reflection on the side of the car, and it's I mentioned previously about knowing when the right time to shoot is. There is this piece of metal on a road in front of you, and I also like that we have rigs attached to the car, and the police are blocking off each end of the street, and maybe you're doing a helicopter shot and all that kind of stuff. Really enjoy that, and personally it's quite sad. I'm quite sad that it's changing, and I think I'm trying to think. The last time I shot a real car was, my word, 2 years ago, year and a half ago. So on that principle, it's like one shoot in every 8 or 9 projects I do is possibly a real car.
And do you think this is also influencing or affecting other areas of photography as well, where CGI is maybe taking over more?
I think in some areas of the industry it's completely overtaken, and I think studio and product photography has been decimated by CGI. It's very unusual. Let's take for example a wine company. They used to go to the high street guy and say, here's 200 bottles of wine, photograph them and give us the trannies at the end of the day, and that doesn't happen, because they've got a wireframe of the bottle, they've got their labels that they can UV map onto the bottle, they've got quick light set up, and they've got some 3D whiz in his bedroom doing all the work for them. And so again, speed, budgets, and the necessity not to have to provide and pay for all those studio days. So I think from a product point of view, it's completely taken over.
But changing tack from the advertising work that you've been doing, you've also done a lot of interesting personal work. I quite like the fact that in your personal landscapes, for example, they're not so HDR. Everybody's doing these HDR landscapes these days, and they're much more. They've got more of a traditional film kind of quality to them.
Well, I think this kind of takes me back to Chris Joyce again in many ways, because Chris was very much be about the photograph, be about you being part of that scene. Don't try and make it something it isn't. And when you capture it, then put your signature on top of it, and that's kind of stuck with me. And I love shooting in America. I always have, and I find the big open landscapes of America. I just love being in the middle of them, because it's just that emptiness that it's peaceful. It allows you to do what you want, and I love waiting for that absolute moment that landscape photography allows you to do. And it's quite a solo experience. It's quite it's quite gratifying actually to just feel that moment when you're pushing the button and it's got right, and I do like taking pictures of people, of course I do, but I find that landscapes for me, it's more an expression of how I feel about things, and I love it, and it's something that for me is the passion of what I get out of photography. That's what takes me right back to basics. Trust them.
But despite that, things will still go wrong. So what can go wrong when you go on location?
There's many things can go wrong. In fact, I have a saying that if nothing goes wrong in a shoot, even if it's something, I don't know, like a reflector rips or something like that, if nothing goes wrong, then the shoot hasn't gone right. So I'm a great, maybe it's a little sort of, maybe a little thing I take with me as a good luck charm, more or less. But I had one particular shoot that we were shooting in Nevada, in Black Rock Desert, which is where they host the Burning Man, and we were shooting very early in the morning. At dawn, we'd driven into the desert in the middle of the night. We were literally in the middle of a dry desert. We did the shot. We were finished ridiculously early because it just needed one backplate, a car driving past it. We got it, so we decided to drive at high speed through the desert, and my assistant at the time was driving, and we drove into quicksand. Which makes a very funny noise when you're doing 85, 90 miles an hour, and the car dipped, and we went, okay. So we then had to get out of the car, and it was when we were shooting a film as well, so we had to get all the film out and empty the car, and the car just went up and up and up to the point where the back wheels were off the ground, and we could see the car getting pulled into this. And a very long story short was that the art director was he was freaking out, totally freaking out in the middle of nowhere. And my assistant at the time was an ex-SAS soldier, and so he said, right, I'm going to have to go and get this sorted. So he disappeared off into the desert in a heat haze as he disappeared. And it was before mobile phones or anything like that, or internet. There was nothing we could do to get hold of anyone. And we started getting dive bombed by these huge beetle things, like birds. And the art director he ran off into the middle of the desert. And I had this lid of an Eskimo cooler, and I was batting this thing away and trying to get the art director to come back. It was farcical, and and there was kit blowing everywhere, and the sandstorm arrived, and then again, sort of 7 or 8 hours later, my assistant came back, and we were able to pull the car out. And the car was a complete mess. It was full of mud, and we drove into Reno that night into this posh hotel. He turned us away because we looked like we just come out of a scene from hillbilly movie somewhere.
It must have been grateful to be alive after that.
Yeah, but I love things like that, and I think they're the things that make shoots more successful. They can be touchy at times, but it's so they generally have a good, happy ending.
And what about the future of the industry? I mean, there's been a lot of changes that you've already discussed already, with CGI becoming more dominant. I mean, sort of thinking generally about where the industry is going, what predictions do you have?
Well, personally, I think it is changing and will change radically. I mean, if you look at the younger generation, they are engrossed in tablets and social media, and I don't think any of us know where that's going. And I think that will come out naturally in time, But personally, as a photographer, I think it's really, really difficult now to I think for people who arrive in the industry and want to be photographers commercially, I think it has to be more than that. They have to have that foundation of the belief in why they want to be photographers. Should it be portraits, weddings, advertising, whatever? You have to believe in what you want to do. And I think you have to specialise in an area. You can't be a jack of all trades and try and be, the car photographer, the fashion guy. You need to do what you're passionate about it and follow it and go deep into it and arrive at a point where you believe in that and believe in yourself to do it. And also, I think the days of just being a photographer are gone. I think you need to be able to shoot video. You need to be able to edit videos. You need to be aware of sound in moving images. You need to be aware of social media. You need to purpose all your images for all of these different formats and different styles, and you need to know color spaces for web production, for print production. It's a much more in-depth process than it ever was when we became photographers.
But that selection process that you're talking about, where it's become more and more important to specialise, and had a dramatic effect on the industry, don't you think?
Well, I do, and that's quite difficult, particularly from a student's point of view, because I remember when I was at Bournemouth, and we were a really, really strong year. There's most of my year and the peers around me, we all survived, and we're all still heavily involved in the industry, which is unusual for a college, and we won the Benson Hedges Awards back in the day and stuff, and we had a really good output through the college, and we all thought that we were going to walk out of Bournemouth into London and be the next David Bailey, and that was just a no-brainer. And how different it was. You need that experience, that hands-on experience, and the old adage that you need to work for somebody for a year before you can do it. It's not always true, but personally I think as a rule of thumb, it's generally the right way to do it. And I think unless you have that experience, you're not going to know what you want to do. And if you want to be a fashion photographer, don't expect Nick Knight to be saying come and work with me, because every student in the country is going to want to work with him. But if you're passionate enough and you maintain that belief, at some point Nick Knight may let you in to do that, but you need to follow all the avenues. And there's no point really going into a still life studio to photograph matchboxes when you want to photograph high fashion photography, or vice versa. So you should learn all the disciplines and get an experience of them, but if you get to that point where you want to move forward, then you have to make your mind up. And then another thing that Chris Joyce said to me, he said, the minute you look at what I'm doing and think you would light it differently and do it better is the time that you need to become your own photographer. And it's really true. You have to make that decision, and only you as a photographer can do that. And a lot of people want to work in libraries and stuff now. They just want that photographic based experience, but you have to be passionate as an image maker or a photographer, and I use that term image maker because I think the new generation of photographers coming out need to know film, they need to know video, they need to know photography. But if it's photography as a pure form they want, then they just have to believe in themselves as photographers to do that. You know, don't not take other opportunities, but you have to believe in what you want to do and believe where you want to go to.
Well, it's been great having a chance to come here and talk to you. I love the work that you've been doing. It's fascinating finding out about the CGI. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Cheers. Thank you.